For 3 years, he lived one door away from his own wife and never once reached for her. Every night at exactly 9 p.m., Lily Carter would place a cup of chamomile tea outside Ethan Calloway's bedroom door, the porcelain always warm against her palms, the faint scent of honey rising into the quiet hallway, and every morning, without a word, the cup would be gone, cleaned, and left on the kitchen counter as if it had never meant anything at all, as if she had never meant anything at all. And that was how their marriage worked, silent, careful, untouched, like two strangers politely, orbiting the same space without ever colliding, without ever asking why. The house itself was too large for just two people, nearly 9,000 square feet of glass and marble that echoed even the smallest sound. Yet somehow it still felt empty, especially at night, when the city lights stretched through the floor-to-ceiling windows and painted soft reflections across the polished floors, and Lily would stand there sometimes, barefoot, holding that cup of tea a second longer than she needed to, as if waiting for something invisible to change, but nothing ever did. Ethan had made the rules clear on the day they got married, his voice calm, distant, almost gentle in a way that made it harder to argue. "Don't expect anything from me," he had said, adjusting his cufflinks as if he were discussing a business contract instead of a life, and Lily had simply nodded, because she had always been the kind of person who understood silence better than words, the kind who didn't push, didn't demand, didn't ask why someone looked past her instead of at her. So she became part of the house, part of the routine, part of the background of Ethan Calloway's perfectly controlled life, and in return, she asked for nothing, not even a place beside him at night. Their bedrooms stayed separate, 2 doors across the hall, always closed, always quiet, and the space between them slowly turned into something heavier than distance, something that settled into the air like dust you couldn't quite see but could always feel. Tonight, though, something was different, so small it almost didn't exist, and yet it changed everything, because at 9 p.m., the hallway remained empty, no soft footsteps, no gentle clink of porcelain, no faint trace of chamomile drifting through the air, and when Ethan stepped out of his office an hour later, loosening his tie after a long day that had felt exactly like every other day before it, he paused without understanding why, his eyes instinctively moving to the floor outside his door. And for the first time in 3 years, there was nothing there, no cup, no warmth, no quiet gesture waiting for him, just cold marble and silence. And something about that absence felt louder than anything he had ever ignored. At first, Ethan told himself it meant nothing, just a small break in a routine that had never required his attention. And yet he did not go back into his room right away. He stood there in the hallway for a few seconds longer than necessary, his hand still resting on the doorframe, as if waiting for something to appear, but the silence remained, heavy and still, and he finally stepped inside, closing the door behind him with the same quiet precision he always used, though tonight it sounded different, sharper, as if the house itself had noticed the absence too. He loosened his tie completely and placed it on the chair, his movements controlled, practiced, but his eyes kept drifting back to the door, to the space where the cup should have been, and for reasons he could not explain, he felt a faint irritation, not toward her, but toward the disruption itself, as if something small and predictable had been taken away from a system that had always worked perfectly. He sat at the edge of his bed, the room dim except for the soft glow of the city lights outside, and he tried to focus on the emails waiting on his phone, the numbers, the schedules, the deals that usually filled his mind without effort, but the silence followed him, pressing in from the hallway, slipping under the door, and after a few minutes, he set the phone down without replying to anything. It was a strange feeling, unfamiliar in a way he did not like, not quite discomfort, not quite concern, just a quiet awareness that something was missing, something he had never once considered important until it was gone. He stood up again, almost automatically, and walked toward the door, his steps slow, measured, as if he were giving himself time to change his mind. But he did not. He opened it and stepped back into the hallway, the marble cool beneath his feet, the air still carrying no trace of chamomile, no warmth, nothing. Lily's door was closed, just as it always was, a simple white door that had never drawn his attention before, and yet now his gaze lingered on it, not with urgency, but with a quiet question he could not quite form. He had never knocked on that door, not once in 3 years, There had never been a reason to, and yet tonight, standing there in the dim light, he found himself wondering what was on the other side, what her evenings looked like when she was not placing tea outside his room, what filled her time, what filled her silence, and why, suddenly, it mattered enough for him to notice. He did not knock, he did not move closer, but he did not leave either, and for a brief moment, the distance between those two doors felt smaller than it had ever been, not because anything had changed between them, but because for the first time, Ethan Calloway was standing in that space not as a man passing through, but as someone who had finally stopped long enough to feel it. He told himself to go back to his room, to let the night pass the way every other night had passed for the past 3 years, quiet and untouched, but his feet did not move, and instead, his gaze remained fixed on that closed door, the one he had never needed to open, the one that had always belonged to a life he chose not to step into. A memory surfaced without permission, something small, almost insignificant, from the early days of their marriage, the first week she had moved into this house, when everything still felt unfamiliar even to him. And he remembered walking down the hallway late at night and seeing her standing there, holding that same porcelain cup with both hands, hesitating just outside his door as if gathering the courage to leave it there. Her movements careful, almost apologetic, like she was afraid even. The sound of porcelain touching marble might disturb him. He had watched from a distance that night, unnoticed, and when she finally placed the cup down and stepped away, she had paused for a moment, just a second, her fingers lingering in the air where the warmth had been, before she turned and walked back to her room without looking back, and he had thought nothing of it then, had dismissed it as a harmless habit that would fade with time, but it never did. Night after night, she repeated the same quiet ritual, never missing a single evening, never knocking, never asking if he wanted it, just leaving it there as if it were a promise she made only to herself. And he had accepted it in the same way he accepted everything else in his life, without question, without emotion, until now, when its absence felt louder than its presence had ever been. He shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the cool wall beside him, grounding himself in the stillness. But the thought remained, persistent and unfamiliar, because he realized something he had never considered before. He did not actually know anything about her, not beyond her name, not beyond the role she quietly fulfilled in his life, and that realization did not sit well with him. What did she do during the day when he was not home? What did she think about? What made her smile? Or if she even smiled at all? And more importantly, why had she stopped tonight? Why had the one constant in this house suddenly disappeared without a word? He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and for the first time, the rules he had set 3 years ago felt less like control and more like distance he no longer fully understood. And though he still did not raise his hand to knock, his body remained there, caught in a quiet hesitation that had never existed before, as if something unseen had shifted between those two doors, something small but irreversible. And somewhere on the other side, Lily Carter was no longer just part of the silence. She had become the reason he could hear it. The hesitation stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the silence to feel almost like an answer, and yet it was not enough to make him leave, because something underneath that stillness felt wrong in a way he could not ignore, not sharp, not urgent, but quietly unsettling, like a shift in rhythm that only becomes noticeable once it stops. Ethan finally stepped closer to her door, each step measured, controlled, but no longer effortless, and when he stood in front of it, the distance that had once felt natural now felt deliberate, like something he had chosen without ever questioning why. He lifted his hand, just slightly, not enough to knock, just enough to feel the hesitation settle into his fingers, and then he lowered it again, exhaling softly, telling himself there was no reason to cross that line, that whatever had changed tonight did not require his involvement, that this was still the same arrangement they had agreed on, the same quiet distance that had worked for 3 years without issue. But as he turned slightly, ready to step away, a faint sound stopped him, something small and uneven, barely there, like a breath that did not complete itself, and it came from the other side of the door. His expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough to break the calm surface he always carried, and this time, he did not hesitate as long. His knuckles touched the door once, light but clear, the sound echoing softly in the hallway, and when there was no response, he waited, counting the seconds without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, and then he tried again, a little firmer this time. "Lily," he said, her name unfamiliar on his voice, like something he had not used enough to recognize. Still nothing answered him, not footsteps, not a voice, not even the quiet movement he might have expected, and that was when the unease settled deeper, no longer something he could dismiss as a passing thought. He reached for the handle without overthinking it, his fingers closing around the cool metal, and for a brief second, he paused again, not because he wanted to stop, but because this was the first time he was about to step into a space that had never been his, a boundary he had drawn and respected for years, and crossing it felt like changing something he could not take back. Then he turned the handle. The room beyond was dim, the lights off except for a faint glow from a small lamp near the bed, casting a soft, warm circle that barely reached the corners. And for a moment, everything looked still, almost peaceful, until his eyes adjusted and found her. Lily was on the floor beside the bed, one hand resting loosely against the edge of the mattress as if she had tried to hold on to it, her breathing shallow, uneven, her hair falling across her face in quiet disarray, and the stillness of the room suddenly felt too heavy, too fragile, like something that had been holding itself together just long enough to break. Ethan stepped forward without thinking, the distance between them gone in seconds, and as he lowered himself beside her, his hand hovered for only a moment before it reached her shoulder, the contact careful, uncertain, but real, and for the first time in 3 years, he did not pull back. Her skin felt warm under his hand, warmer than it should have been, and for a brief moment Ethan froze, not because he did not know what to do, but because he was not used to being this close, not used to the quiet vulnerability of another person within his reach, especially not hers, and yet he did not pull away. His hand remained where it was, steady now, grounding both of them in a moment that felt unfamiliar and real at the same time. "Lily," he said again, softer this time, his voice losing that distant edge it always carried, and when there was still no response, he shifted closer, carefully brushing the strands of hair away from her face, revealing features that always seemed composed, always calm, now touched by something fragile, something he had never seen before. He glanced around the room quickly, taking in the details without meaning to, the neatly folded blanket on the bed, the small lamp casting its quiet glow, and then his eyes landed on a notebook resting on the nightstand, its edges worn, pages slightly uneven as if it had been opened and closed many times, and beside it, a pen placed with careful precision. Something about it felt personal, out of place in a life he had never bothered to understand, but he did not reach for it yet, his attention returning to her as he adjusted. His position, sliding one arm behind her shoulders to lift her slightly, supporting her weight with a gentleness that surprised even him. Her head rested lightly against his arm, and for a moment, he noticed how light she felt, how quiet her presence was even in this state, as if she had always taken up as little space as possible in his world. He reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, bringing it closer, his movements slower now, more deliberate, and he spoke again, not expecting an answer, but needing to fill the silence that no longer felt comfortable. "You need to wake up," he murmured, the words simple, but carrying something underneath that he did not stop to examine. As he held the glass near her, his gaze drifted back to the notebook again, curiosity pressing gently at the edge of his thoughts, and this time, without overthinking it, he reached for it with his free hand, flipping it open just enough to see the first page, and what he found there stilled him completely. It was not random notes or scattered thoughts. It was organized, careful, filled with dates, times, small observations written in neat handwriting, entries about his schedule, his preferences, the way he took his coffee, the time he usually returned home, even the nights he skipped dinner without notice, and each detail was recorded not with obligation, but with quiet attention, like someone who had been watching, learning, remembering without ever asking to be seen. He turned another page, and then another, and the pattern continued, small, consistent, deeply personal in a way that made something shift inside him, because he realized, with a clarity that settled slowly but firmly, that while he had spent 3 years keeping his distance, she had spent those same 3 years understanding him in silence, and suddenly, the absence of a single cup of tea no longer felt small at all. He did not close the notebook right away, his eyes lingering on the pages as if the words might shift if he looked long enough, as if there might be a line that explained why she had done all of this without ever asking for anything in return. But there was no explanation, only quiet consistency day after day, detail after detail. A life he had never noticed unfolding right beside his own. His grip on the notebook tightened slightly before he exhaled and set it back exactly where he found it. Careful, almost instinctively respectful of something that no longer felt insignificant. And when his attention returned to her, something inside him had already changed, not in a dramatic way, not something visible, but enough to make him stay. He adjusted his hold on her, lifting her a little more securely, his movements steady now, less hesitant, and he guided her onto the bed, placing her down with a care that felt unfamiliar in his own hands, as if he were learning something without being taught. The room remained quiet, the soft light casting shadows across the walls, and for a moment, he simply stood there beside her, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, slower now, but still uneven, and that small detail held his attention in a way nothing else had that day. He reached for the glass again, setting it closer within reach, then hesitated before sitting down at the edge of the bed, a position he had never taken in this room, a place he had never allowed himself to occupy. His hand moved almost without instruction, brushing lightly against her wrist, not to check anything specific, just to feel, to confirm that she was there, that she was real, and when his fingers rested there, he did not pull away, not this time. The contact was simple, quiet, but it carried something he could not ignore, something that settled into the space between them and stayed. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. He did not check, he did not reach for his phone, he did not return to his room, and for the first time in years, his schedule no longer dictated his next move. Instead, a different thought began to take shape, slow and unfamiliar, pressing through the structure he had built so carefully, because he realized that if she had not collapsed tonight, if nothing had interrupted that routine, he would have continued living exactly the same way, accepting everything she gave without ever seeing it, without ever asking if she was still there behind those quiet gestures. The idea settled deeper than he expected, not as guilt, but as something quieter, heavier, something that made him question a reality he had never challenged. He looked at her again, at the stillness of her expression, at the faint tension that had not yet fully left her features, and for the first time, a thought formed with clarity, not about obligation, not about arrangement, but about absence, because the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like something that could disappear, something that could leave, and the realization came without warning, quiet but undeniable, that he did not know what this house would feel like without her in it, and that uncertainty, more than anything else, made him stay exactly where he was. The night moved quietly around them, but for Ethan, time no longer felt like something measured in hours. It stretched in moments, in the steady rhythm of her breathing, in the faint warmth of her wrist beneath his fingers, and in the unfamiliar stillness that kept him from leaving, because leaving now felt different than it ever had before. At some point, her breathing began to even out, not fully steady, but calmer than before, and the tension in her face softened just enough for him to notice. And that small change held his attention in a way that felt almost unreasonable, as if something inside him had shifted its focus entirely without asking for permission. He did not realize how long he had been sitting there until a faint light began to filter through the curtains, the dark blue of night slowly giving way to a softer gray. And for the first time in years, he had not slept in his own room, had not followed the structure that had always defined his days, and yet there was no immediate urge to correct it. Instead, there was a quiet awareness that something had already changed, something subtle but irreversible, and it settled into him with a calm he did not expect. A soft movement pulled his attention back to her, her fingers shifting slightly against the fabric of the bed, her breathing catching for just a moment before continuing, and instinctively, his hand adjusted, not pulling away, but grounding her again without thinking, and that unconscious response made him pause, because it was not something he had chosen, it was something he had done. He watched her for another moment before slowly withdrawing his hand, not abruptly, but carefully, as if even that small distance needed to be handled with care, and he stood up from the edge of the bed, his movements quieter now, more aware of the space around him. His gaze moved once more across the room, landing briefly on the notebook, then the glass of water, then back to her, and each detail felt connected in a way he had never seen before, like pieces of a life that had been quietly unfolding just out of reach. He stepped toward the door, his hand resting on the handle, and for a second, he hesitated again, not out of uncertainty this time, but out of something deeper, something that felt like reluctance, as if leaving now meant returning to a version of himself that no longer fit as easily as it once did. The hallway outside was still quiet when he finally stepped out. The same polished floors, the same muted light, the same space that had never asked anything of him. And yet it did not feel the same, not after what he had seen, not after what he had allowed himself to notice. His eyes moved instinctively to the spot outside his own door, the place where the cup should have been, and even in the early morning light, the absence remained, unchanged, but now it carried weight, not as a missing object, but as a question he could no longer ignore. He stood there for a moment longer before turning away, but this time, the silence did not follow him as something distant. It stayed with him, close, persistent, and for the first time, it was not something he could simply walk past. By late afternoon, the house had returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but for Ethan, nothing felt aligned the way it once did, because every familiar detail now carried a second layer he could not ignore, and it followed him even as he stepped into a space he had always controlled with precision, a formal gathering arranged weeks in advance, filled with voices, polished smiles, and expectations that had never once felt complicated until now. The room was bright, nearly 20 feet of glass overlooking the city, conversations flowing easily between business partners and family representatives, and Ethan stood among them the way he always did, composed, distant, every word measured, every response calculated. But his attention was no longer fully there, because somewhere beneath the surface of every conversation was the quiet image of a dim room, a warm wrist under his hand, and a notebook filled with details he had never earned. "We should finalize the transfer by next quarter," someone said, their tone smooth, confident. But Ethan only nodded slightly, his mind catching on something else entirely, something that came from across the room, where Lily stood near the window, her posture calm, her presence almost blending into the background the way it always had. And yet now, she did not feel invisible to him anymore. She wore something simple, soft in color, her hair falling naturally over her shoulders. And though she looked composed, there was a distance in her eyes that had not been there before, not because it was new, but because he was only now able to see it. Another voice cut in, lighter, sharper, drawing attention. "She is still here," a woman said with a quiet laugh that did not quite hide its meaning, glancing toward Lily with a look that lingered too long. "I thought arrangements like this were temporary." And a few people nearby exchanged subtle looks, the kind that carried judgment without needing to say anything more. In the past, Ethan would have let it pass, would have remained silent, because silence had always been the easiest choice, the most efficient. But this time, the words did not fade into the background. They stayed, pressing against something that had already shifted inside him. His gaze moved directly to Lily, just for a second, enough to see the way she lowered her eyes slightly, not in shame, but in habit, as if she had learned long ago not to expect anyone to speak for her, and that quiet acceptance unsettled him more than the comment itself. The conversation around him continued, but he was no longer part of it, because the distance he had maintained for 3 years suddenly felt like something others were using, something that allowed them to define her place without challenge, and that realization settled quickly, clearly, leaving no space for the kind of hesitation he had relied on before. He set his glass down without a word and stepped forward, closing the space between them with a calm certainty that drew attention without needing to raise his voice. And when he reached her, his hand moved before he could overthink it, gently but firmly taking hers, the contact unmistakable, grounding, real. The room quieted just enough to notice, just enough for the shift to settle in, and Ethan's voice followed, steady, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it. Something that did not ask for permission. "She is not temporary," he said, his eyes lifting to meet the ones that had questioned her place. "She is my wife." And this time, the words did not feel like an arrangement. They felt like a decision he was no longer willing to leave unspoken. The room did not return to normal after that. Even though conversations slowly resumed and glasses lifted again as if nothing had shifted, because something had shifted, and it stayed in the air, quiet but undeniable, the kind of change that does not need to be announced twice. And Ethan did not release her hand right away, not out of obligation, but because letting go now would feel like undoing something he had just chosen to make real. Lily stood beside him, still, her fingers slightly tense in his at first, as if unsure whether this moment would hold or disappear like everything else had before, and for a brief second, she glanced at him, not fully, just enough to search for something in his expression, something that could tell her whether this was temporary or true, and for the first time, he did not look away. There was no dramatic shift in his face, no sudden softness that would make it easy to understand, but there was presence, steady and certain, something that had not been there before, and that alone made her breath pause for just a moment before it continued again. He guided her gently through the rest of the evening, not pulling her forward, not placing her on display, just staying beside her in a way that quietly changed the space around them. And when people approached, their tone had shifted, more careful now, more aware, and Ethan did not correct them again, because he did not need to. The message had already settled where it needed to be. When they finally returned home, the house felt different the moment the door closed behind them. Not larger, not quieter, but more aware, as if it had been waiting for something to return with them, something that had never fully existed before. Ethan loosened his tie slowly, his movements unhurried, and for once, he did not head straight toward his room. Instead, he paused in the hallway, the same place he had stood the night before, and his gaze moved to her door without hesitation this time. Lily had already stepped away, her pace calm, her posture composed, but there was a distance in her silence that felt different from before, not invisible, not unnoticed, but cautious, as if she had learned not to trust sudden changes too quickly. She reached her door and paused for just a second before opening it, and that was when his voice stopped her. "Lily," he said, and again, her name felt unfamiliar in the air, not because it was new, but because it had not been used enough to carry weight until now. She turned slightly, her hand still resting on the door, her eyes meeting his with quiet patience, waiting, not expecting, and that difference was something he felt more clearly than anything else. He took a step forward, closing part of the distance between them, but not all of it, not yet, and for a moment, the words did not come easily, not because he did not know what to say, but because he had spent so long choosing not to say anything at all. "About earlier," he began, his voice steady but slower than usual. "I meant it." And the simplicity of the sentence made it heavier, not lighter, because there was no explanation attached, no justification, just truth offered without structure. She watched him for a second longer, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softened just slightly, not with relief, but with something more careful, something that asked without speaking whether this would last beyond a single moment. "You do not have to say that because of them," she said quietly, her voice gentle, controlled, carrying no accusation, only clarity, and that was when he realized how easily she could have misunderstood, how easily she could have accepted that moment as something done for appearance, for convenience, for control, and that realization made him step closer again, this time without stopping. "I did not say it for them," he replied, and there was something firmer in his voice now, something grounded in a certainty he had only just begun to understand himself. "I said it because it is true." The silence that followed was not empty. It held something between them, something fragile but real, and for the first time, neither of them stepped away from it. His gaze shifted briefly past her shoulder, into her room, and then back to her, and without asking, without overthinking, he said, "Can I come in?" And the question itself changed something, because it acknowledged a boundary he had never respected before, a space that had always belonged only to her. She hesitated, just for a second, not out of resistance, but out of surprise, and then she nodded once, stepping slightly aside to let him pass. The room felt the same as the night before, quiet, soft light, everything in its place, but now he was standing in it by choice, not by urgency, and that made every detail feel different. He moved slowly, not exploring, not searching, just existing in the space, And when he reached the edge of the bed, he did not sit immediately. Instead, he turned back to her, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the distance between them smaller than it had ever been, but still present enough to matter. "You stopped the tea," he said finally, not as a question, but as an observation, and she nodded slightly, her fingers resting lightly against the doorframe. "Yes," she answered, and her voice did not waver. "I thought maybe it was time." And that answer settled into him with more weight than he expected, because it was not about the tea, it was about something ending quietly, something she had carried alone for 3 years finally reaching its limit. He took a slow breath, letting that truth sit without rushing past it. And then he moved, closing the remaining distance between them, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to stand within reach. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, softer, but clear. "Do not stop because you think it does not matter," he said, and for a second, his hand lifted slightly, as if deciding whether to reach for hers again. And this time, he did, his fingers closing gently around hers, steady, certain. It mattered. He continued, his eyes holding hers, not looking away. "I just did not know it until now." The words were simple, but they carried everything he had not said for 3 years, everything he had chosen not to see. And for the first time, he did not hide from that truth. He let it exist between them, fully, without distance. She did not respond right away, her gaze dropping briefly to their hands before returning to his face. And there was something in her expression that shifted, not completely, not all at once, but enough to show that something inside her had heard him, even if it was not ready to believe it fully yet. He did not rush her, did not fill the silence with more